Welcome to History 111, Lecture 36, Popular Sovereignty. Now, out of all this debate about the Compromise of 1850, there's an increasing discontent in the country about people receiving the potential for more pro-slavery legislation. And a man named Chase from Ohio is going to spearhead a movement who's going to really protest the pro-slavery wing of the Democratic Party. And this is going to result in a political realignment and a new party altogether. So in January 1854, he's going to publish what he calls his Appeal to the Independent Democrat, and it's going to express a lot of discontent with Congress, and it's going to talk about, in particular, what's happening in Nebraska, which we'll get into a bit later. And there's going to be a lot of social dissatisfaction with all of this legislation that's happening, and it's going to really escalate into political action. Now, it's going to become apparent very quickly to these people who are Democrats, but they're protesting the pro-slavery wing of their own party, that they need their own party altogether. And in February 1854, they meet in Wisconsin, and they pull together groups known as the Conscience Whigs, who have been former members of the Whig Party, which is really itself dying, Free Soil people, and Abolitionist Democrats. And this new political party is going to call themselves Republicans. Now, one of the main pieces of legislation people were finding dissatisfaction with was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, the slavery debate really at this point reaches its peak, although it's not necessarily the only issue at hand. Now, the act itself is proposed by Stephen Douglas, and what he wants to do is divide the region into two territories, the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory. Now, the issue of slavery here had been previously settled by the Missouri Compromise in 1820. And again, you need to recall that one drew a line down the map where slavery was permitted below the line but not above. Well, this territory is above. Now, what it's going to go ahead and do under this act is it's going to go ahead and say that in the Kansas territory, popular sovereignty would be applied, whereas in the Nebraska territory, slavery would be illegal. And what that's going to go ahead and do is it's going to go ahead and push the potential northern boundary of slavery back up again. So here we have a map of what we're talking about, and since these don't line up to modern state boundaries, it's helpful to look at this. Now, if you see Missouri being the state with the northernmost slavery, if you draw a line right from the southern border, that's supposed to be the northern limit. With this particular piece of legislation, this territory sitting right there, Kansas, that can go either way, and it's a question open for debate now, whereas previously on the 1820 Compromise, that debate had been closed. So Douglas's role in all of this was really because he was a great compromiser, and he's really trying to compromise with Southern senators within his own party over the railroad industry. He is a senator from Illinois, and what he really truly wants is a transcontinental railroad to pass through Chicago because that's going to provide great benefit to his state. Now, the Southern senators want the railroad line to begin in New Orleans and head west, so Douglas cuts a deal. Kansas gets popular sovereignty, and Chicago gets its railroad. Now, people are very upset by this package, and here we have a political cartoon from that particular time period where we can literally see slavery being shoved down the throat of a free soiler, that they're being forced into this against their will. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to cause particular dissatisfaction among Northern abolitionists. Now, Abraham Lincoln, who was at that point a lawyer in Illinois, is going to issue an address in response to this act in 1854 that's going to really rally the Northern cause against the act. Now, the New England Immigrant Aid Company is also going to start at this time, and they're going to raise money to encourage the immigration of New England abolitionists to Kansas in order to ensure a vote against slavery. And the whole idea is they want to stack the deck in advance of whatever election is going to happen to decide this issue. Now, the Southern reaction to the Kansas-Nebraska Act is very supportive. DeBow's Review, which is a major periodical back then, prints an article called Kansas Matters, and it's really going to encourage Southerners to also do the same thing and move there to influence the vote on slavery. So what's going to happen is Kansas is going to be filled with people of both political views, those who are abolitionists, those who are pro-slavery, and those who feel strongly enough to move to the state so that they can vote whichever way they want it to go, and these people are now going to be forced to live side by side. Now, these events with the Kansas-Nebraska Act are going to really spur on the building of the Republican Party. The Republican Party really starts out as something in Michigan in 1854, where they kind of take control of that state and adopt a platform of anti-slavery themes. And by 1856, they've moved into Pennsylvania and holding national conventions and ultimately nominate someone to run for president. In addition, the New York Tribune and its editor Horace Greeley really kind of buy into the Republican movement, and they're a very popular newspaper, and they're going to go ahead and use that popular newspaper to give a lot of voice to ideals about Republicans Party and give a lot of credibility and publicity to that particular cause. Now, while abolitionism hadn't been particularly popular in the North, although it was growing, there was one of these events that happened that really polarizes Northern opinion, and involves a man named Charles Sumner. Now, Charles Sumner was a senator from Massachusetts who gave a speech called The Crime Against Kansas, and it specifically attacked Stephen Douglas and Andrew Butler of South Carolina. Now, Preston Brooks, who was a cousin of Butler and a congressman of South Carolina, was outraged by the speech, and Brooks came onto the floor of Congress and beat Sumner with his cane, and Sumner was badly injured. Now, the killing of Charles Sumner is going to send shockwaves through the country, and Republicans are going to run extensive coverage in the newspapers, and it's going to really increase support for the party as a direct result. Now, if we think back to what was happening in Kansas when we left off, there were people from both sides of this issue pouring in to influence the vote, and as more and more people move in, tensions grow high, and we get to the point where there's essentially a civil war going on in Kansas. And both sides are going to be clashing very violently between 1854 and 1858, and a lot of the fighting is over the elections for the territorial legislation and who can control politics in the run-up to this vote on slavery, yes or no. Now, the presidential election of 1856 is occurring during this time with all this context, and they're going to go ahead and run a candidate, John Fremont, who was an ex-military officer and senator from California, and he's the first abolitionist presidential candidate. Now, the Democratic candidate, James Buchanan, ultimately wins, though there was a generally supportive and positive run for the Republicans. It was a very good first showing, it just doesn't get them seated. And here we have a map of the election. What we can see is, by and large, where you see support for Republicans is up in the North. The Democratic Party is really controlling the South at this point. Now, the Whig Party, who had been the other major political party at this point, they're really reduced down to basically Maryland. So they're a dying party, and the Republicans are going to displace them. And when we look at the election of 1860, the Whigs are gone, and it's going to be a Republican and Democrat race for all intents and purposes. And now we need to turn back to Kansas one final time. Now, again, the whole idea here was that Kansas would ultimately draft a constitution that would be approved by a popular vote, and that would just settle the issue of slavery one way or the other. And what happens is there's a lot of maneuvering and violence and other tactics used to keep anti-slavery settlers from voting and guaranteed an acceptance of a constitution that includes slavery. And despite all these problems with it, the Buchanan administration went ahead and recognized it and recommended admission for statehood. Now, this is going to generate huge controversy in Congress, which is eventually going to defeat the statehood measure, because the Republicans made a very strong showing, and they have enough seats to really introduce a lot of debate and make sure this does not go through. And this issue is also going to further split the Democratic Party and discredit Stephen Douglas within it. And that's going to result in basically an almost guaranteed election of a Republican president in 1860. So what's the big idea? You have two things which are very closely related. All these discontent with the Compromise of 1850 is going to lead to the rise of the Republican Party and a political realignment. And very closely related, and one of the things that really spurs on Republicans, is bleeding Kansas. The pouring of both sides in there to try to influence which way this Constitution will go and which way this vote will go about the issue of slavery is going to lead to a near civil war and outright violence for several years within this state. See you in the next lecture.